The birth beneath the floorboards. They say some stories don't just belong to history, they belong to the marrow of the earth itself, soaked so deep into the ground that no matter how many decades pass, the soil keeps whispering. Tonight's story begins on such soil. Frozen Ohio clay, February of 1856, the kind of cold that makes wood scream in its beams and breath crystallize like smoke from the lungs of the dead. On this night, a secret came into the world. 3 secrets, in fact. Born in a place where silence meant survival and sound meant death. And from the moment those boys opened their eyes, nothing in Cedar Mills would ever be the same. What you're about to hear is not folklore, not the embellishment of rumor, but testimony preserved in journals and letters that were never meant to see daylight. And when you hear what those children could do, you may wish they had remained buried. That a town built on quiet fear. Cedar Mills was a fragile thread of a town, a mere 300 souls stitched into the Ohio wilderness. Life here balanced on the knife edge between God's mercy and man's cruelty. The Quaker community, draped in gray coats and plain bonnets, believed in peace, equality, and silence. But their meeting house, with its humble brick face and unassuming windows, was more than a place of prayer. It was Station 14 on the Underground Railroad. Every beam, every floorboard, every whispering post carried the weight of lives passing through it. At its heart stood Elder Samuel Whitmore, a man whose gray eyes had seen enough to know that righteousness rarely went unpunished. For nearly a decade, Samuel had hidden men, women, and children beneath his church, smuggling them through the night with the kind of quiet determination that could only come from faith or desperation. But that February, faith alone would not be enough. The arrival of Ruth. 3 nights before the Garrett brothers rode into town, a girl arrived. She called herself Ruth. 19 at most, belly round with life, eyes sharp with the kind of knowing that unsettles even the most grounded soul. She was not like the others. Yes, she had fled bondage in Kentucky. Yes, she was tired, worn, frightened. But there was something else, an aura that prickled the skin of everyone around her. Ruth seemed to sense things. She refused food that would later sour. She named a liar in their midst before anyone could prove the deceit. And sometimes, when the room hushed and she stared into the dark, it seemed she was listening to voices no one else could hear. Samuel's wife Martha wrote of it later. It was as if the girl stood half in this world and half in another. When she spoke, I often felt the air move before she formed the words. And now, she was about to bring children into that world. On the very night their enemies drew closer, the riders in the cold snow fell heavy on the 23rd, each flake thick as a coin, smothering Cedar Mills under a hush that felt almost holy. But holiness does not stop dogs. Nor does it stop the Garrett brothers, bounty hunters notorious for selling flesh like cattle, men whose boots had stained a dozen towns with betrayal. By sundown, whispers reached Samuel that they were near, armed with dogs, guns, and the kind of certainty that only comes when someone inside has already betrayed you. That evening as Samuel prayed, the coded knock rattled the door. 3 quick, pause, 2 more. He opened to find Joshua, a freedom seeker he had sheltered before, wild-eyed, snow clinging to his beard. They're coming, he rasped. Less than 2 hours. His gaze flicked toward the trapdoor. Someone talked. Samuel's blood turned to ice. And beneath his feet, Ruth cried out, not the cry of fear but the cry of labor. Her time had come. The birth without sound. The basement of the meeting house was dim, cramped, smelling of soil and tallow candles. Martha and her daughter Rebecca descended into the shadows, where Ruth lay on a straw mattress. But it was no ordinary birth. She was calm, too calm. No cries, no writhing, no sweat. Her breathing came slow, steady, measured, as though she had been preparing for this moment her whole life. And when Martha pressed her ear to Ruth's belly, she heard 3 heartbeats. Ruth opened her eyes, luminous in the flickering light, and whispered, 3. They've been waiting. The first child emerged without a sound. No wail, no cry. His eyes opened immediately, black and glassy, scanning the room with eerie awareness. Then the second, then the third, each slipping into the world as silently as their mother had promised. Above, boots thundered across the floorboards. The hunters were inside. Dogs whined, claws scratching close, too close. One even paused atop the hidden trapdoor, nails clicking against the wood. But not one of those newborn boys cried. Not one whimpered. They stared upward, wide-eyed, as though they knew their survival depended on silence. And for 3 hours, while the Garrett brothers cursed and tore through the house, those babies remained still as carved stone. Only when the men had gone, when the sound of horses faded into the snow, did the children loose their voices. And they cried together, in perfect unison, their wails blending into one chilling note that seemed to shake the very beams of the basement. That an hour later, Ruth bled out. Her final words to Martha were a warning: they'll know things. Always. But remember, they are not like other children. The community's decision with Ruth gone, the Quakers faced a terrible choice. No papers, no father, no legal record. Just 3 boys born into a world that already wanted them erased. Samuel decreed they would be raised by the community, each family sharing the burden, the secrecy, and the danger. They named them Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac. Triplets, rare enough in any place, but here in a basement that smelled of fear and earth, they felt less like children and more like omens, and almost immediately Martha noticed things. The way the infants would turn their heads all at once, eyes locked on doorways where, moments later, an angry man would appear. How they refused to look at liars even in jest. How, when someone spoke falsehood, they grew restless, twisting and crying until the truth was revealed. By their first year, the journal notes are clear. These boys did not simply hear or see. They knew. The first omen: on a late autumn night, Samuel gathered with townsfolk in the meeting house. A traveling merchant had arrived, claiming to be a simple peddler en route to Columbus. The triplets, barely able to walk, froze the moment they saw him. Their dark eyes fixed upon his face. Then as one they turned away. Refused food. Refused to be near him. And in the silence of the meeting house, they began to whisper in that strange, fluid language Ruth had once spoken. 2 weeks later, the man was arrested. In his wagon, the body of his murdered partner. And so the whispers began, in Cedar Mills and beyond. These were not ordinary boys. These were children who could see straight through the masks people wore. And if they could see lies, what else might they see? The knowing eyes. Growing unease. By the time Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac reached their 2nd birthday, Cedar Mills no longer saw them as blessings. They were necessities, yes. Their presence made the meeting house one of the most secure stations on the Underground Railroad, but no one who looked into their unblinking black eyes could say they felt at ease. Martha Whitmore, who bore the weight of their upbringing more than anyone else, filled her journal with notes that read less like a grandmother's fond memories and more like the observations of a scientist studying creatures she didn't quite understand. They do not babble like other children. They whisper in their strange tongue, a river speech. They do not laugh as boys should, but stare, always stare. They know when I lie to them, even about small things. I told them the porridge was finished when the pot was half full. All 3 turned away and would not eat until I admitted the truth. It was a small thing perhaps, but to Martha and Samuel, it was the beginning of something more sinister. The knowing look. By their 3rd year, the triplets had developed a habit that chilled the marrow of every adult in Cedar Mills. They would stop, mid-play, mid-sentence, mid-breath, and stare. All at once. Their tiny faces would harden with an expression no child should wear, an ancient, judging gaze, like men twice their age weighing the soul of whoever stood before them. The town began to call it the knowing look. At first, it happened rarely. But soon it became routine. A stranger at the store would make some claim about his past, and the boys would fix him with their gaze. A neighbor would deny forgetting a debt, and the boys would stare until sweat beaded his brow. Then later truth would unravel. The debt unpaid. The past falsified. It was more than lie detection, it was revelation. The boys seemed to peer past words, straight into whatever rot or darkness a man thought hidden. And worse, they whispered to each other when it happened. Not in English. Not in any known tongue. Always that flowing, water-like murmur, their voices overlapping until no adult could follow. The first true test. The community's gratitude soon warred with terror. Because while the boys could unmask a liar, what else could they unmask? The first true test came in the spring of 1859. A family of 5 arrived under cover of night, freedom seekers from Virginia, tired and terrified. Samuel welcomed them as always, but the triplets refused to descend into the basement with them. They screamed. Not like children frightened by shadows, but with the shrill, unearthly cry of animals warning of poison. Their faces twisted, fingers pointing at the eldest son, a boy of 15 who stood silent beside his family. Isaac spoke first. He is not your brother. The family gasped. Martha begged them to explain, but all 3 boys only repeated it. Not your brother. He brings harm. Samuel faced the hardest decision of his life. To send away a frightened family was to sign their death warrant. But the boys had never been wrong. He hesitated, prayed, then chose mercy. He allowed the family to stay. By dawn, the answer revealed itself. When Samuel checked the basement, he found the 15-year-old boy gone, and with him a portion of the community's stored food. Days later, word spread. A teenage informant had sold details of safe houses to bounty hunters. His description matched the brother exactly. The family swore they had never seen him before meeting him on the road. He had joined them at a river crossing, claiming kinship, and they had trusted him. The boys had not. The Whisper Network. After that, the triplets became legends within the Underground Railroad. Conductors requested Cedar Mills specifically, knowing that if the boys remained calm they could rest easy. If the boys grew restless, it was a sure sign of betrayal, but the blessing brought a curse. The more people whispered about the boys' gift, the more unwanted attention drifted toward Cedar Mills. Rumors reached the ears of bounty hunters and opportunists alike. Men who saw in the triplets not miracles but tools. Weapons. Martha's journals from 1860 are filled with dread. The boys cannot sleep. At night they shiver and clutch each other, whispering in their strange tongue. They say they hear crying. I pressed them to explain, but they only wept harder. Hours later, news came from Portsmouth. A conductor shot in the street. The boys had felt it. The first long-distance sensing. It began on a bitter January morning, when the triplets woke screaming. Not the tantrum of toddlers, but a keening wail of such despair that it froze Martha where she stood. They clutched each other, eyes wide, sobbing, inconsolable. 6 hours later, word arrived. A group of 11, including a pregnant woman, had been captured 30 miles south. The woman had given birth during the march back to Kentucky. Both she and her child had perished. The timing matched precisely. At first, Samuel prayed it was coincidence. But then it happened again. And again. Each time, the boys reacted to violence before the news could travel. Their tiny bodies shook, temperatures dropped, pulses synchronized as if one nervous system spanned 3 frames. They were not just readers of men's hearts. They were receivers of distant horror. The price of knowing, but knowledge has a cost. The boys grew strange. They rarely smiled. Rarely played. They whispered more often, huddled together, eyes darting to things no one else could see. Even when calm, they unnerved the townsfolk. Who could relax in the presence of children who knew the darkest corners of your thoughts? Neighbors stopped visiting. Families who once volunteered to help raise them pulled back, leaving Martha nearly alone in her burden. She confessed in one entry, "I fear what they see in me. When they look, I feel laid bare, my sins spread open like pages of a book. And though I love them, I dread their gaze." The boys knew. They always knew. And the weight of that knowledge pressed heavier each day. The scream in the clearing. It was in the spring of 1862, as war raged across the land, that Cedar Mills faced its darkest betrayal. James Morrison, a conductor trusted for years, arrived with 12 freedom seekers. Samuel welcomed him with open arms. But the moment Morrison entered the meeting house, the triplets erupted. They screamed. Not cries, not tantrums, but an animal shriek so primal that men dropped tools and women covered their ears. The boys clawed at the floor, their faces contorted in terror, pointing at Morrison. "Death," they shrieked. "He brings death. Tomorrow night. Miller's Creek." Samuel's faith faltered. Morrison was a friend. A brother. Could children's screams outweigh years of trust? He hesitated. Chose compromise. The next night, Morrison led the freedom seekers into the woods. Gunshots split the dark. 7 died, including children. The rest were dragged back in chains. And Morrison, the trusted ally, pocketed his blood money. Back in Cedar Mills, the triplets did not weep. They only whispered to each other, eyes hard as stone, and Isaac said one thing that chilled Samuel's soul: people never listen. But now, they will. The prophets of death. The war reaches Cedar Mills by 1861. Cedar Mills was no longer a quiet village of Quakers and cornfields. The Civil War had turned Ohio into a trembling borderland. Soldiers passed through like ghosts, some in Union blue, others deserters in rags. Word of massacres and betrayals trickled in with each wagon. And through it all, the triplets grew, 6 years old now, tall for their age, faces pale from long days spent indoors. They rarely smiled, rarely laughed. They had become watchers, silent, black-eyed sentinels perched by windows, their gazes fixed south toward the river. Martha tried to treat them as children. Toys carved from wood, songs sung in soft voices. But they refused to play. Instead, they whispered in their strange tongue, voices overlapping like a chorus of water. At times, they froze, eyes glazing with horror, clutching each other's hands. When asked what they saw, Isaac once answered simply, "Too many people are going to die." 3 days later, the Battle of Bull Run was reported. Thousands dead. Predictions that could not be ignored at first. Samuel tried to dismiss it as coincidence. But the pattern was undeniable. Whenever the boys grew restless, whenever they whispered with that vacant, glassy stare, tragedy followed. They didn't just sense violence. They predicted in September of 1861, a young Union soldier named Thomas Caldwell passed through Cedar Mills on leave. The boys looked at him once and began whispering. Martha, frightened, asked what they saw. Ezra answered with words far too old for a 6-year-old child. He won't make it home. The man he trusts will kill him for his money at the river. Caldwell laughed when told. He had no money, he insisted. He traveled alone. He thanked the Quakers for their kindness and left point 3 days later. His body was found near a river crossing. Shot in the back. His friend, a deserter, caught with his boots and meager pay. After that, no one in Cedar Mills doubted the boys again. The cold detachment but belief brought no comfort. For the triplets were not prophets wringing their hands at visions of doom. They were detached. Their voices flat, their eyes empty, as if death was merely an observation. When asked why they did not warn Caldwell more forcefully, Isaac replied, he would not have listened. When pressed further, Caleb added, it is not our duty to save them. Only to know. The words chilled Samuel. 6-year-old boys should not speak of duty. They should not speak of inevitability. But they did. And every prediction they made came to pass. The Morrison aftermath of betrayal at Miller's Creek haunted the town. Families whispered about it long after. Not only because of the massacre, but because of the boys' reaction afterward. They had not wept. They had not raged, they had only whispered, then stared at Samuel with eyes that seemed far too knowing. People never listen, Isaac said again. But they will. And Samuel, though a man of faith, began to wonder if what the boys carried was less a gift from God than something else entirely. Something that had slipped into the world through Ruth's poisoned womb, a mutation or worse, an omen. The death calendar. By early 1862, the triplets' abilities sharpened to a terrifying point. They no longer spoke only of distant battles. They spoke of individuals. A man would pass through town, and the boys would whisper, 3 days. A woman would smile and shake hands, and the boys would murmur, tonight. And each time, the prediction came true. Martha begged them not to speak such things aloud, but the boys only shook their heads. We see what we see. Soon, the community began to call their murmurs the death calendar. A name spoken with dread, for no one wanted to be on it. The horror at Miller's Creek. But the incident that changed everything came in the spring of 1862. A new group of 12 freedom seekers arrived. Men, women, and children desperate for safety. And with them came James Morrison once more. The triplets saw him and screamed again just as before. But this time their cries were not ignored. They fell to the ground, clawing at the dirt, voices shrill. Tomorrow night. You will call them. He brings death. Samuel's faith broke. He confronted Morrison, accused him of betrayal. Morrison swore on scripture, on years of service. But Samuel saw the boy's eyes and knew. This time he acted. He sent word ahead. He placed watchers along the trail, and when Morrison led his group to Miller's Creek, Samuel's men witnessed it firsthand. Morrison calling into the dark, bounty hunters emerging, chains rattling, guns firing. 7 killed. 5 taken. And Morrison pocketing his silver. The triplets' judgment. When Samuel delivered the news back to Cedar Mills, he expected tears. Instead, the boys' faces hardened. People never listen, Isaac repeated. But now they must. They had known Morrison was false for months. They had known he would betray. And though they had tried to warn, they had not begged. They had not wept, they had only known. Samuel realized with a sinking horror that they were no longer children. They were something else. Something apart. The warning. One night that summer, Samuel awoke to find the triplets standing over his bed, their faces pale in the moonlight, eyes gleaming. Mr. Whitmore, Caleb whispered, his voice flat. Yes? Samuel croaked, heart hammering. You pray for peace, Ezra said. You hope for mercy, Isaac added. Then all three spoke together, their voices blending into one unholy chorus. But we see what's coming. And mercy will not save you. The anatomy of the impossible. The arrival of Dr. Hartwell. By the brutal winter of 1863, when the war had soaked the land in blood, Cedar Mills received a visitor who would alter the course of the triplet story forever. Her name was Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, one of the first women physicians in Ohio, trained in neurology at the Medical College in Cincinnati. She was young, barely 30, but carried herself with the unyielding calm of someone accustomed to skepticism and ridicule. She had heard whispers, children who could see through lies, children who sensed death before it came. At first she dismissed it as folklore. But when letters arrived from her late colleague Dr. Harrison, recounting incidents too precise to ignore, her scientific hunger overcame her doubts. So she came, through snow and danger, to see the triplets for herself. The Quakers received her warily. They distrusted outsiders, and for good reason. Too many spies wore friendly faces. But Samuel, weighed down by the boy's growing strangeness, allowed it. Perhaps science could explain what faith and fear could not. The examination Dr. Hartwell began with the simple tests: sight, hearing, reflex. Each boy passed easily, but there was more. When she pricked Caleb's finger, Ezra flinched. When she shone light into Isaac's eyes, Caleb blinked. Their bodies, it seemed, were not separate but entangled. She pushed harder. She measured their pulses, their breath, their body heat. And then she froze. All three pulsed together. Not just similar rhythms, identical. Their heartbeats rose and fell in perfect sync, as though one drum beat within three chests. When she applied mild electrical current to Caleb's arm, the other two jerked as if shocked. That it was as if one nervous system had been divided across three bodies. The language of Ruth. But the most disturbing moment came when she asked them to lie. A volunteer was brought in and told to state a false name. The boys turned, stared, then whispered in that strange, flowing tongue their mother had spoken as she bled to death on the straw. Dr. Hartwell leaned close. She did not understand the words, but she understood the effect. The boys' pupils dilated, their skin grew clammy, and the air in the room seemed to thrum with something unseen. Later in her notes she wrote, "They are not guessing. They are not reading expressions. They are perceiving something deeper, something measurable but beyond the instruments I possess. Their brains resonate as if tuned to frequencies the rest of us cannot detect." The revelation. For weeks she studied them, noting every detail. And finally, she reached a conclusion that chilled her more than any battlefield casualty report ever had. The boys were sensitive to the electromagnetic fields generated by the human brain. Where others saw only faces, they felt the flicker of deceit in the nervous system, the crackle of fear, the shadow of violent intent. They were not prophets. Not mystics. Not divine. They were mutations. The mother's body. Dr. Hartwell demanded to see Ruth's grave. Against Quaker tradition, she obtained permission to study her remains. What she found made her blood run cold. Ruth's tissues bore signs of massive chemical exposure. Mercury compounds, lead pigments, industrial toxins used on indigo plantations. Substances that warped nerves, poisoned blood, and in Ruth's case, rewrote her children before they ever breathed their first air. The triplets were not accidents. They were evolution forced by suffering, and worse, Dr. Hartwell believed their mutations were heritable. "These boys are the first of many," she wrote. "Each child they sire will carry the same gift. And each generation the sensitivity will grow. Within a century humanity may diverge into two species, those who see only with their eyes, and those who see the truth behind every mask." The government knows her findings were explosive. And word traveled fast in wartime. By February of 1863, federal marshals arrived in Cedar Mills with quiet orders: bring the triplets to Washington. There they would be used, for interrogating prisoners, for unmasking spies, for reading the hearts of enemies. But the boys knew long before the knock at the door. They stood waiting at dawn, their few belongings bundled. "Mr. Whitmore," Caleb said softly, "we must go. If we stay, bad things will happen here." Isaac's eyes gleamed black. "They don't want to protect us. They want to cut us open. And when they're finished, they'll come for our children." Samuel, torn between fear and duty, begged them to reconsider. But Ezra only shook his head. "We have seen their thoughts. We know what they plan. We will not be their tools." And with that, they vanished into the caves and woods, leaving behind the only home they had ever known. The final warning as they disappeared into the treeline, Isaac turned back one last time. His voice was soft, but it carried like thunder. "There are others. Children like us. Born in secret, poisoned into change. Scattered across the land." Ezra added, "One day we'll find them. We'll gather. We'll teach them what we know." And Caleb's final words froze Samuel's soul. "We'll be watching. Always. And when the world is ready, we'll return." The marshals arrived 3 hours later to an empty house, and the triplets of Cedar Mills were never seen again. The children of the shadow whispers. After the vanishing, when the triplets slipped into the forests of southern Ohio, the world thought they were gone forever. The marshals searched with dogs and lanterns. Soldiers scoured ravines and caves. Rewards were posted. But not even footprints remained. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed them. For Cedar Mills, their absence was like a phantom limb. The meeting house, once alive with clandestine traffic, felt hollow. Samuel Whitmore grew gray with regret, haunted by the last words of the boys he had raised. Martha, her journals heavy with sorrow, wrote, "The silence is worse than their presence. I miss them, but I cannot forget their eyes. Sometimes I wake at night certain they are watching from the darkened corners of the room. Life stumbled on. The war ended. The Underground Railroad disbanded into history. But the boys, the knowers, were not done with the world. The reports begin in 1874. A farmer in Pennsylvania spoke of his daughter who would wake screaming hours before barn fires were discovered, always pointing to the exact spot of origin. In 1881, twin boys in Texas were said to walk straight to missing livestock, no matter the distance, no matter the terrain. In 1892, a child in California unnerved her schoolteacher by announcing calmly, "He isn't your husband," moments before the man's double life was revealed. Each story was dismissed as rumor, coincidence, frontier myth. But to those who had known the triplets, or had read Martha's hidden journals, the pattern was undeniable. The knowing had not died in the woods. It had spread. Dr. Hartwell's lost papers. Dr. Hartwell, heartbroken by the disappearance, returned to Cincinnati with her notes sealed in iron chests. She petitioned the government to study her findings, but instead they classified and buried them, afraid of what such knowledge might unleash. Privately she wrote, "The Cedar Mills triplets are not unique. If the mutation is heritable, we should expect to see others emerging wherever mothers were exposed to similar poisons. Industrial towns, mining camps, plantations steeped in chemicals. Each war, each calamity will birth new children of this kind, witnesses to the hidden horrors of man." Her words proved prophetic. By the turn of the century, reports of children who knew stretched coast to coast. The pattern of violence, the pattern was consistent. These children were born during turmoil. Their mothers often sickened during pregnancy, poisoned by chemicals or hardship. And the children carried with them the terrible burden of sight beyond sight. But there was another pattern, tragedy. Few lived long lives. Families often concealed them, fearing persecution. Communities shunned them, whispering of curses. Some were institutionalized. Others vanished entirely. One chilling case emerged from Illinois in 1907. A boy named Matthew was said to predict murders days before they occurred. When a deputy pressed him for detail, the boy whispered, "I only know what the bad men will do." He was found dead 2 weeks later, drowned in a mill pond. His body bore no wounds, but his face, they said, looked calm. Too calm. The genealogical clues in 1923, during renovations of an old farmhouse near Cedar Mills, a discovery electrified local historians. Hidden beneath floorboards was a packet of letters, unsigned, written in 3 different hands, but all ending with the same phrase, "The Children of Cedar Mills." The letters contained genealogies, names, marriages, births, tracing lines of descent from the triplets themselves. Proof they had not died in the woods. They had lived, loved, and fathered children, and their children had inherited the knowing. More disturbing were the predictions written in the margins. Events yet to occur. World wars, the testing of a terrible bomb in the desert, a man walking on the moon. Predictions too precise to be dismissed. Every one came true. The gathering. By the early 20th century, a rumor spread quietly among academics and occult circles alike. The descendants of Cedar Mills were not only alive, but communicating, finding one another, gathering in secret. There were scattered reports of groups working together in strange ways. In Chicago, a circle of young men who located missing children with eerie accuracy. In Georgia, a woman who predicted train crashes with such precision the railroad quietly paid her to keep silent. In New York, a boy who refused to enter a crowded tenement, whispering, "The walls will fall," hours before the building collapsed. These were not coincidences. They were echoes. The Cedar Mills triplets had seeded a new kind of people across the country. And if their descendants were gathering, the question was not whether they existed, but what they wanted. The letter in the dust in 1923, tucked in with the genealogies, one final note was found. Written in a tight, deliberate hand, it bore no date, only a single instruction. "When you are ready to know, come to this place on the anniversary of our birth. We will be waiting." The address was Ohio farmland, not 20 miles from where the triplets had vanished 60 years earlier. And at the bottom, a final sentence, "We are still watching. We always will be." The last gathering. The modern rumors. By the mid-20th century, the children of Cedar Mills were no longer myth. They were urban legend. FBI case files mention them obliquely, anomalous predictive individuals. Secret societies claimed to be in contact with them. Newspapers ran tabloid stories of psychic triplets in rural America. Most people dismissed it. Just another folktale. But those who had seen the records, the predictions too precise, the genealogies too neat, knew better. The children had not only survived. They had multiplied. A century of watching. In 1945, Just days before Hiroshima, an unnamed boy in Ohio collapsed screaming, "The sun is falling, the sun is falling." He would not stop until the bomb was dropped. In 1963, a girl in Dallas fainted outside a motorcade route, clutching her head, muttering over and over, "Not the driver, not the driver." In 2001, a commuter in New York abandoned the subway minutes before the towers fell, writing later in his journal, "They told me not to go underground today. They told me." Always the same pattern, they knew. Always dismissed, buried, erased. But the traces were there for those who dared connect them. The hidden lineages. By the 21st century, geneticists began quietly noticing anomalies in certain family lines. A subtle neurological difference. A clustering of descendants that could all be traced back, if one looked carefully enough, to a small Ohio town in the mid-1800s. Cedar Mills. What had begun as 3 boys locked in a basement had become something more. A lineage. A secret nation within the nation. The children of Cedar Mills no longer whispered in fear, they whispered in numbers. The meeting place in 2020, during a survey of abandoned farmland near Cedar Mills, workers uncovered something unsettling. Beneath a collapsed barn was a vast chamber dug into the earth. Not a cellar, not a root pit, but a gathering hall. Benches carved into the stone. Symbols etched into the walls, and in the center an iron-bound box. Inside, dozens of journals, all written in the same strange, spidery script. Each journal contained predictions spanning generations. Some were already fulfilled. Others pointed to years yet to come. One page in particular was dated with chilling precision. August 19, 2025. The final warning. The entry read, "On this day the watchers shall reveal themselves. The descendants will no longer hide. They will gather where the first 3 vanished, beneath the trees that swallowed them. They will speak as one voice and the world will listen." No detail was given of what they would say. Only the final line, "When the knowing becomes one, the world will bend." The anniversary. And so here we are. August 19, 2025. The woods outside Cedar Mills are quiet, but not empty. If you stand there long enough, you may hear it, a hum beneath the soil as though voices are gathering underground. A chorus of whispers. Some say they are here to guide us, to steer us away from catastrophe. Others say they are here to rule, their patience finally worn thin after a century of hiding. All we know is this: the triplets are gone, but their blood remains. And tonight, the children of Cedar Mills gather again. If you go to the woods, you might see them. If you listen too closely, you might hear them, and if you feel a hand on your shoulder in the dark, do not turn around, they already know you.